Again, another good question. Let me just spend a little bit going back to the previous one regarding health care. One way to solve part of the problem is you apply tax credits for every American that would equal almost enough to buy a high deductible catastrophic plan. And if you don't use it, well then you're not on the plan. But if you spend a few hundred extra dollars, combine that with a health savings account, now you've got coverage and we've increased the size of the risk pool. That way we use a carrot, not an unconstitutional stick. Now, regarding earmarks, I had a question of Senator Jim DeMint last September before he endorsed me. He asked me about earmarks. I said, well, you know, Dr. Ron Paul made an argument during the presidential run that earmarks were good. It was a way of the legislative branch balancing off the power of the executive branch. It was part of the separation of powers, part of checks and balances. What do you say to that? And he said, Chuck, compared to when you worked for Ronald Reagan in the Pentagon, there are now 1,000 times more earmarks than there were when you worked on Capitol Hill back in the mid-'80s. 1,000 times. Earmarks are the gateway drug. And what happens is people who are otherwise fiscally prudent individuals rationalize and justify voting for routine appropriations bills that are 10, 15, 20, 30% more than the year before, because they got a $10 million bridge or hospital or library in their district. Now, that does not benefit California. California is the intellectual creation engine of America. And more so than places like Kansas or Nebraska, we benefit when we can attract capital to the United States through low taxes, less red tape, less capital gains taxes. That's how you can create wealth, not by simply moving money around in the form of earmarks.
Thank you. We each have a minute for a rebuttal if you care to use it.
I do. I wanted to say one thing else about the budget deficit, and that's Graham Rudman Hollings. So the last year I was in Congress was 10 years ago. So blame them, not me. And in the year 2000, we actually balanced the budget. And the reason we did was we had the threat of automatic across-the-board cuts if Congress didn't come in with a deficit reduction on a 10-year plan. That was Graham Rudman. Sadly, under the Republicans, Graham Rudman was allowed to lapse when we were running the House and Senate. It needs to be restored. And so, yes, the earmark issue is very important. And fundamentally, let's get a system that will supplant the absence of backbone. If you can't find the backbone in the House and Senate, then have a system that says, if you don't hit these targets for reduction of the deficit, there will be an across-the-board cut. What it did was to bring the big spenders to the table, and then they had to agree. And I think that would be the first step to getting us back to fiscal sanity.
Thank you.
Let me just be very clear on earmarks. I will not vote for any appropriations bill that contains an earmark. End of story. Regarding spending discipline in Congress, certainly Graham Rudman Hollings was one mechanism, but as I recall, that only dealt with discretionary spending and did not deal with the gigantic gorilla in the room, or gorillas, Medicare and Social Security. We now have an $86 trillion unfunded liability in Medicare and Social Security. That is roughly the equivalent of $350,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we have to contend with. Now, the way I think that we can do it is unleash the creative genius of America by cutting business taxes, cutting capital gains taxes, and cutting the Federal Register, i.e. federal red tape, to unleash the creative genius of hardworking Americans. We have to grow the economy.
The next question will be also on fiscal issues. Both of you are running to represent the state of California. How would you help the state of California get out of the fiscal disaster it finds itself in? Mr. DeVore.
Well, as a U.S. Senator, we just basically go with what I just mentioned. California benefits when there are large sums of money that we can invest in the venture capital, when we can invest in creating new jobs and improving efficiency, making new products, and getting those products out to the rest of America and to the world. We don't benefit in a regime of high taxes and red tape and inflation because people hold on to their money. They become risk adverse. And what's happening now is that 535 members of Congress and your president think that they are smarter than 300 million people each making decisions for what's good for them. And as they then seek to direct where that money goes, for example, with the $800 billion stimulus, what ends up happening is we're borrowing money from China that our kids and grandkids are going to be enslaved to pay back for the rest of their lives. The Chinese want their money back with interest. You can't just write it off. You've got to give it to them. And we are destroying the economic opportunity of future generations through our policies. Now, in the state of California, as a legislator, and please don't hold that against me, my very last bill in this session, my last bill as a state assemblyman, is a bill that would open up the coast of California to the 3-mile limit to slant drilling to get at the more than 1 billion barrels of oil that we don't have. Now, you may recall the bill last year that would have opened up the first new offshore oil lease in California in 40 years, passed the state Senate. I was the author of that bill before the Sierra Club killed it in the state assembly. My bill incentivizes the oil companies to prepay their royalties and would generate $16 billion toward the $20 billion deficit currently in Sacramento.
Time, thank you.
I want to add to what Assemblyman DeVore said, and it's an area of agriculture which we need to speak about because it's the biggest industry in the state. I don't believe we disagree on this at all, so I'm not by way of saying I disagree. But let me point out the essentiality of agriculture to our state's economy. There is no bigger industry. There is no bigger industry. And we have a man-made drought right now in the Central Valley. There's a natural drought and there's a man-made drought. And the man-made drought comes about because the Endangered Species Act has been used to cut off the flow of Central Valley water. The Obama administration has said we'll give a temporary accommodation maybe of 20% of your traditional allocation. And there is no guarantee that will last beyond this month, let alone be reliable. What we need in the state of California for a long-term competitive economic growth and thus balancing the budget and everything beneficial is long-term supply of water. In addition to a reasonable interpretation of the Endangered Species Act instead of an absolutist interpretation of the Endangered Species Act. So that ESA, the Endangered Species Act, that's the short term. Let me say a word about the long term. 192 million acre-feet fall on the state in the form of rain and snow every year. 120 go into the ground to replenish our aquifers, leaving 72 million for beneficial use. 20 of that, 20 million, goes to agriculture. 20 million goes to wild and scenic rivers in the Bay Delta Accord. Isn't that interesting? The same amount of money goes for environment as goes for agriculture. 5 goes for cities and in industrial use, and 25 flows off into the Pacific Ocean. We need to capture that water. We need to expand the dam at Shasta. We need to expand the reservoir at Los Vaqueros. We need to expand the system of transferring between the state canal and the federal canal. And when agriculture comes back, our state's strongest engine of growth will come back.
Thank you.